Hello everyone.
Welcome back to our discussion on books. We are your hosts.
I am Miss Maka.
And I'm Mr. Daryl. Ms. Maka, what are we discussing today?
So today we're discussing The Tenant of Wildfell Hall by Anne Bronte.
Very good. It's the second and final book that she ever wrote, and it was published sometime in 1848.
Yeah, and it had an instant and phenomenal success.
That's the best kind of success.
Exactly. But of course, before we start discussing our book, we will look at our agenda. We will start with the vocabulary that you need during the book discussion. Then we will talk about the author of the book. After that, we're going to talk about the summary of the book.
From there, we will move to look at the characters, some of the main characters of the book. Mm-hmm. We will move to the setting as well, looking at the when and the where of the story. And then we'll look at the main themes of the book, followed by homework.
Of course, by our homework. Let's start. What is the first word, Mr. Daryl?
Well, Ms. Maka, the first word is a verb, to reject. To reject. This is when you refuse to take or have something.
Uarqopa.
Our next word is gloomy, an adjective, gloomy. This is something that's hopeless or despairing, pessimistic in outlook.
Sevdiani, nagvliani.
Well, our next word is vicar. Vicar, it's a noun. This is a member of a church who takes care of the parish that's around him, the community that's around him.
We also use in Georgian vikari, samrevlos mghteli.
Our next word is an adjective, and it is reticent. Reticent. This is when you're disposed to be silent or you feel like you can't speak freely.
Gulchatxhrobili, sitqva.
Our next verb is to reconcile. To reconcile. This is to cause a person to accept or be resigned to something that he doesn't really want.
Sherigeba, azrebis shejereba.
Our next word is rumor. Rumor, it's a noun. This is information, often a mixture of truth and untruth, passed around verbally or vocally.
Chori.
Our next word is affection. Affection. Fond attachment, devotion, or love for something.
Siqvaruli, ketilganწყობა.
It's a good word. Our last word of today is gamble. A gamble, not the verb, but the noun, gamble. Any matter or thing involving high risk or dangerous uncertainty.
Azartuli tamashi.
Well, now, we move to our author, Anne Bronte.
Yeah.
Quick point. This is the third of three very talented Bronte sisters. How do you imagine hanging out with them one evening in the Bronte household would have been?
Oh, that would be very interesting, I think. I think they would sit just around the table and discuss lots of books. Charlotte Bronte like kind of criticizing her sister for some books.
We'll get to that later.
Exactly. So, I don't know. It would be interesting, I think.
There might have been a few fights, but...
Exactly.
Well, let's start with Anne's biography.
Okay, so now let's get to the facts about the author, right? So Anne Bronte, who was born in 1820 and died in 1849, actually very young. She was an English novelist and poet, and the youngest member of the Bronte's family. Anne Bronte was the daughter of Patrick Bronte, a poor Irish clergyman. So this poor conditions actually defined her life, later life, to be honest.
In 1846, she published a book of poems with her sisters, and later two novels, under the male name, which we've talked about, a pen name, Acton Bell. And it was a bad time for women writers, so she had to use a male name to get across. Her first novel, Agnes Grey, was published in 1847 with Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. Her second novel, which is the topic of today, The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, was published in 1848. And it was thought to be one of the first substantial feminist novels.
And also we have to add that she attended the boarding school, and although she was a great writer, she also worked as a governess. So, as I've already mentioned, she died very young at the age of 29, probably because of tuberculosis, right? But after her death, the sister, Charlotte Bronte, edited Agnes Grey to fix issues with its first edition, but prevented republication of today's novel.
Could she have been jealous, perhaps?
Maybe.
This is one reason, in fact, why Anne is not as well known as Emily and Charlotte. Nonetheless, both of Anne's novels are considered to be classics.
Yeah, but in this case, we would say that Charlotte Bronte, maybe she did not criticize her sister because of jealousy, but because she really thought so.
That it was a bad book?
Yeah, maybe.
Possibly.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Okay, now I think it is time for the question to our lovely audience. So why do you think the youngest sister, Anne, was not as popular as her two sisters?
I think that Anne never got the recognition she deserved because Charlotte Bronte was jealous. Also, she disapproved of Anne's book and its themes.
Yeah,
Okay,
exactly.
so
So she also thinks so.
Yeah. You're right, though. I mean, she might have been, it might have been sisterly rivalry.
Maybe, of course.
Well, now, let's move on to the summary, shall we?
Of course.
Let's begin. The novel is framed as a series of letters from this character named Gilbert Markham to his friend about the events connected to meeting a mysterious young widow. So a widow is a woman who has lost her husband, calling herself Helen Graham, who arrives at Wildfell Hall, an Elizabethan mansion which has been empty for many years, with a young son and a servant.
And contrary to the 19th century's norms, she pursues an artist's career and begins to make money by selling her pictures. So this behavior actually arises lots of gossip in the neighboring village, and soon she becomes a social outcast.
A few things happen, but essentially, refusing to believe anything about her scandalous past, this character Gilbert befriends her and discovers more about her past. She gives him a diary, and in the diary, she chronicles her previous husband's physical and moral decline through alcohol, debauchery as well, in this very kind of aristocratic society that's not too moral.
Yeah, and ultimately she flees with her son, and actually she wants to save her son from the influence of his father. And the depiction of marital strife and women's professional identification has also a strong moral message mitigated by Anne Bronte's belief of universal salvation.
So she was a bit religious as well.
Exactly.
Okay, and after Huntington's death, Gilbert and Helen marry, so these two, the boy and the girl, and most critics now consider The Tenant of Wildfell Hall to be one of the first feminist novels.
Yeah, and there was one critic, she was called May Sinclair, in 1911. She said that slamming of Helen's door, so bedroom door, against her husband, actually reverberated throughout Victorian England. And in leaving her husband and taking away her child, she fought against not only the social norms, but also the law. English law for that time.
We've read a lot of books for these shows, and this is the first time I'm seeing a 19th century woman character leave her husband with child and strike out on her own.
Yes, and she must have been very rebellious for that time.
Which is a reflection of the author as well, probably,
yes.
Anne's character.
Exactly.
This leads us to a question for the audience. Why do you think May Sinclair, this critic she was talking about just now, wrote about this book being an early feminist classic?
May Sinclair calls this book a feminist classic because in it the female protagonist rebels against the standard expectations of the era and goes off on her own path.
Exactly exactly what I think as well.
Yeah, of course. She must have had huge courage to do so, to behave so. Yeah, and now it is time to move on and talk about the characters. And we're going to open the character list with Helen Lawrence Huntington. This is Helen Graham, is her mother's maiden name, and the protagonist of the novel and the tenant of the title.
Helen. And Wildfell Hall is very important as well with Helen. It's the place where she and her brother were born. And after their mother's death, she goes to live with her aunt and uncle elsewhere. And while her brother stays with the father.
Yeah, and in spite of their separation with her brother, she still maintains a very good relationship with him. And soon, like after some time in the novel, we can see that her brother helps her while she is trying to escape from those problems that she has.
We have some theories as to where she might have got this character from. There was a famous poet at the time, Byron, Lord Byron. Everyone's heard of him. She might have based this character on Byron's actual wife. Now, like Byron's wife, Helen believed that reforming her husband's behavior was her religious obligation. As you know, Lord Byron was a big rebel, and his wife tried to change his personality. And this is where possibly Anne gets her idea for this character.
Yeah, our next character is Gilbert Markham. So the 24-year-old farmer, and is the principal narrator of the novel. He exhibits jealousy and anger, but during the course of the novel, he grows morally and proves to be a worthy man. So he changes his personality throughout the novel.
We'll next move to Arthur Huntington. Now this is the sort of villain of the book, Ellen's abusive and alcoholic husband. He himself is a Byronic figure, so he's kind of based on that poet, Lord Byron. People are fascinated by him, but he also has a lot of moral failings.
Yeah. His abusive behavior actually impels Helen to run away from him, despite the fact that he was once injured when he fell from the horse.
Helen returns to Grassdale to take care of him, but unwilling to stop drinking alcohol, he gets worse and worse and he finally dies.
Yeah. So some aspects of the life and character of the author's brother Branwell Bronte correspond to those of Arthur's in the Tenant. So he resembles Branwell Bronte in three ways. So the three ways are physical, good-looking, like he is described this way, romantic, adventurous, and especially in his alcoholism.
So she's basing these characters on people she knows or has seen in popular culture of the time, whether the famous poet or her brother or other people. Let's move over to the last character, Frederick Lawrence. This is Helen's brother, and he's the one that helps her escape from Arthur and lends her money to survive.
Yeah, and as he and Helen grew up together, grew up apart from each other, they only met in Stanningley, and no one in Lingarcar village could have guessed that they were sister and brother.
Eventually he marries a character named Esther, but Helen can't come to his wedding because she's in mourning for the husband.
Okay, I guess that's all from the characters list, and now it is time to ask a question to our audience. Is Gilbert Markham as a character really worthy or Helen's love?
I think that he is. First thing first, Helen herself decides that he's fine for her. And second, despite having some particularly bad character traits in the beginning, throughout the novel, he develops as a person, and in that end, he's grown and mature man.
Yeah, thank you very much. I guess maybe we can consider that he has changed his character because of love.
Because of love, and it shows that Anne could present complicated characters. He starts off bad, but then he becomes good.
Exactly, and also we can see that there are two types of men she's trying to describe, like one who can change and the one who is
Dies
yeah,
because
who
of
dies.
alcoholism
Exactly,
and so on. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Well, let's move over to the setting. Now let's present the background to the novel. This will be a look at the when and the where, as you know. Now, with the when of the story, it begins, as you know, in 1847, mid-19th century, but flashes back to the period of the earlier 19th century, 1820 to about 1830, so that decade, before it goes back to the 40s, late 40s. Well, this was a time of a lot of romanticism as well. Gothic literature was coming up in England. And the influence of Lord Byron, for example, he was a very famous rebel poet of that time. He left England in disgrace. He was scandalized by a lot of lots of scandals. And he goes over to Greece and he dies as a revolutionary fighter for the Greeks.
Wow, interesting. Yeah, and now let's move on to the where part of the story. And from the very beginning, from the title of the book, we can say that the story happens in Wildfell Hall, Lindercar. The biographer, Bronte's biographer, Guerin, believed that the original of Wildfell Hall was Ponder Hall and a farmhouse near Stanbury in the West Yorkshire. Pondon shares certain architectural details with Wildfell, including the similarity of the windows.
And the other place we're talking about is Lindencar, a village that Wildfell Hall stands close to and is in Yorkshire. Car, the second part of that name, in the Northern English dialect means a pool or a pond, a small part of water in a dirty, marshy, swampy ground. And Linden, which translates in Northern English as hope, means a small valley. So it's just the name basically describes the physical place of where the story happens.
Yeah, or maybe some symbols that she wanted to show.
Let's move over to a question for the audience. Now, Anne Bronte bases her setting of Wildfell Hall on a real location. Do you think this makes the book stronger in its effect on the reader?
Yes, I do think that it makes the book stronger for the writer to use real location as an inspiration for their settings. The writer can really present the setting with insight and knowledge that gives the book a depth of realism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, these are kinds of questions that I like to hear from the audience. The style of the author's intent. Mm-hmm. She chooses real places to talk about, real characters to base her own characters on. And does this make the book stronger? She says yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course it does. Okay, now let's look at the major themes of the novel. So the very first major theme that we have chosen for you is gender relations. So in The Tenant, Anne actually challenges the central tenet of 19th century domestic ideology. So this is women influence on men. And this actually can be seen in other stories like Jane Eyre, where the main heroine fulfills or reduces her ambitions for a wider life by taming and managing her husband.
Mm-hmm. But in this situation with Anne's book, men are not able to be changed by the influence of women. For example, look at the husband of Helen, the main character. She's convinced that she can reform him, but 6 years later, she ends up having to escape from him to protect herself and her young son.
Yeah, and Helen's second husband, Gilbert, who despite many faults, he never changes throughout the story, the novel. Often all Arthur's friends, only Walter is the one who has never been a heavy drinker. He uses his manipulation in an attempt to win Helen's favor.
Mm-hmm. Gilbert's mother, Mrs. Markham, holds the doctrine of that it's the husband's business to please himself and the wife's business is to please him. That was the idea at the time, not very modern at the moment. The portrayal of Helen as a courageous, independent woman emphasizes her ability to to think for herself, and this is something that Anne is kind of pushing the boundary on. So sometimes you look at these books and you think, oh well, they're a little conservative or a little old-fashioned, but actually what's happening is that Anne is pushing the boundary of what was acceptable at that time.
Exactly, of course, by giving lots of examples of at least this domestic life or ideology, right? Okay. So the second main theme, we have realism. Unlike her elder sisters, Anne Bronte did not follow the romantic style in her two novels. So she chose different style. Maybe that's because she was not herself romantic. Who knows? So many critics, including Anne's sister, Charlotte, as we mentioned from the very beginning of our today's program, considered her depiction of alcoholism and adultery overly graphic and disturbing. So she thought that maybe she was exaggerating.
Or going too far.
Exactly.
Yes, but now Anne does defend herself. So she stated her intentions at the beginning of the novel in a preface, in a kind of introductory letter. She says, and I quote, "When we have to do with vice and vicious characters, I maintain it is better to depict them as they really are than as they would wish to appear." So basically she wants to present them as they really are, and that would make people appreciate the dangers of this kind of lifestyle.
So we can easily say in this case that if you really want to see 19th century's England, it means that it is very good to read Anne's books, right? Because she depicted everything in a very real way.
In an original way.
Original way, yeah. Okay, so now it is time to ask a question to our audience. So what is the main differences between Anne and her two sisters, Emily and Charlotte, in terms of writing style?
As you mentioned earlier, Anne Bronte is more of a realist writer, while her two sisters are more romantic in nature.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's so true, and maybe that's the reason she was criticized so many times by her sister, and especially by her sisters, and especially by Charlotte.
By Charlotte. The thing is that she was ahead of her time. She was not of her time. She was probably writing for an audience that was not even born yet. And so what happens to those writers? They get lost in history. So hopefully some of you will start reading Anne Bronte as opposed to Charlotte Bronte. I mean, they're all great, Charlotte, Emily, and Anne, but don't forget Anne.
Of course, don't forget Anne, and enjoy the different styles they have. Okay, now, Mr. Darrell, I think it is time to wrap up the whole thing. And the very first thing we did was talking about the author, Anne Bronte.
If you remember the summary, it's presented as a series of letters from Gilbert to his friend, describing this woman, Helen.
Then we had few characters, like where you would meet different types of men, and the woman who is struggling with life, and she's really fighting against modern time.
Remember, the setting is it's the early part of the 19th century in England, in the Yorkshire region up north.
And of course, the main themes that we have chosen for you, these were realism and gender.
Well, in that case, we should wrap up with a look at the vocabulary once more. And I'll just say it really quickly for the pronunciation purposes. To reject, gloomy; vicar, reticent; to reconcile, rumor; affection; and gamble.
Yes, and now I think it is time to give a homework. Mr. Darrell, what is our today's homework?
Here's a question we'd like you to think about. You've heard now from us about all three Bronte sisters, and we've talked about them several times. They all have their own style. Write about which one is or was your favorite writer, and give all the reasons why.
So, now I will tell it in Georgian. ჩვენგან მოისმინეთ სამივე დის ბრონტების შესახებ, რომელთაგან თითოეული საკუთარი სტილით გამოირჩევა. დაწერეთ რომელ მათგანს ანიჭებთ უპირატესობას და რომელია თქვენი საყვარელი მწერალი და რატომ.
Don't forget to send the homework to the address you see on the screen right now.
დავალებები გამოაგზავნეთ ეკრანზე მითითებულ მისამართზე. Okay, so I think that's all for today. So we should say goodbye to our audience, TV audience. Thank you, the audience, for your interesting answers. See you next week.
Have a great week and keep reading. Goodbye.
Goodbye.